the moment they enter the school system, you start to see that decline, that curiosity, that creativity, that desire to know everything, that, the ability to question everything, like all that starts to decline. And it's because we start to penalize them for asking questions. We start to make everything super structured. There's no room for creativity and for problem solving and to question things.
Anna, thank you so much for coming here today. Very excited to talk about you, your new book, and dive into your story here today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Danny, and for reading my book.
Of course. So I'd love to start with 19 students of yours coming to your wedding. Why do you believe that 19 former students of yours decided to come to surprise you at your wedding?
I was not expecting that question. I still get emotional when I think about that moment. I think that I had a very unique relationship with all the students that I've worked with, in part because I think that I'm very much like a kid myself. And I think a lot about the things that got me excited as a kid to show up to a classroom, or the kind of things that I looked forward, the kind of connections that I wanted to have with the adults in my life. And I knew how important it was when they would pay attention to my stories, even though sometimes they may or may not have been interested in them, but they would, I remember the people that paid attention to me and that made me feel like I had something important to say and just cared. And so when I decided to go into the teaching profession, I knew that that was one of my priorities, to make sure that the people that I worked with, the students that I worked with, felt important, felt heard, and to instill in them a love for learning. And so I went above and beyond to do this. Sometimes that meant deviating from the curriculum, which they happened to like, the students. And I think that made us develop a really close relationship. Even though I was teaching a bunch of kids at the same time, I would really try to find that one thing that would connect me to each of my students. And so they felt that. And for kids, their teachers are a very important figure in their lives, kind of like your parents. They spend a lot of time with you, they're learning from you. And so I think I created a really special bond with them. And so the day of my wedding, at the ceremony, it was just incredible. When I showed up, I see, all my guests, and then I see 3 rows filled with former students of mine from different grades that I had taught. And I just could not believe it. I could not believe it. And they were so excited. They had their iPads out and they were recording the whole thing. Like, it was just a magical moment. And then I spoke to, the parents who told me that they had to take a bus that they rented, that, they were stuck in traffic for a long time. They all fell asleep in the bus and they woke up. They were so excited. And it was just like apparently it was equally as exciting for them as it was for me, and a moment that they're going to remember for a long time. Teaching, I've come to realize that it's a lot about the relationship that you have with the other person. And so we need to cultivate those relationships. And I think that I did a pretty good job doing that. And to the date, I am still in touch with a lot of my students and their parents. A lot of them follow me through social media, and, they think it's really funny that I'm doing all this, and they're excited for me. And so, yeah.
What do you think, other than you created a deep relationship with so many of these children, what about what your teaching style allowed you to do that?
Yeah, so I gave kids something that it sounds simple and straightforward, but it's unbelievably uncommon in schools and at home, actually. But I would give them a lot of autonomy. I gave them choices over a lot of things. And remember that, in school, kids don't really have choices over the things that they learn, the way they learn it, the way, how they get to showcase the things that they're learning, the partners that they get to choose. They sometimes get saying over that, but in general, the big decisions and the important decisions, they don't have a saying. And so and this happens also a lot at home, right? It's like parents are like, because I said so, or because this is the way we do things. And so often kids just don't have a saying and don't have like that many opportunities to own what they're doing or what they're learning. And so I really went out of my way to give my kids choices to the extent that I could. Of course, I still had to follow a curriculum to a certain extent and give assignments and tests. But I would always try to find out, what it is that they were interested in learning about. And, some teachers would be like, how come are your kids are paying attention and are excited to come, to your classroom? Like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, it saves you a lot of trouble if you try to find out what they are already interested in and then you start there. If nobody wants to be forced to learn anything or forced to learn something that you don't understand the value of or how you're going to use it. So if there were things that I had to teach, I would always spend time trying to find out, okay, how am I going to convince my students that they're going to use this in the real world? Like, what are they going to use it for? And sometimes, by the way, I did not have an answer. And I would be like, guys, I don't even know why we're learning this. We're just going to do it so that we can get it out of the way so that we can do the things you guys are interested in. And so I was very real with them. I treat them like adults, which again, huge thing for kids. Like, they don't want to be treated like, little kids. Like, they can do way more than we expect them and that we have in our minds. And so I always sort of knew this, and I would talk to them like adults. I would let them participate and make decisions. I would let them have choices. And I think this really made a difference in the relationship that we had and in their desire to learn the things that I was teaching them.
So you spend so much time with children in schools, and you have an inside look, I feel, at what teachers are doing well and what they're doing poorly as a whole. Generally speaking, what comes to mind when I ask that? What are teachers doing well and what are they doing poorly?
So I think that most of the teachers, at least most of the teachers that I know, go into the profession for the right reasons. They enjoy working with kids. They want to be part of, the group of people shaping the next generation. They enjoy the teaching and learning, right? And so I think that, they have that at heart and they have those great intentions. Unfortunately, when you go into this traditional school system, the industrialized school system, it's really difficult to do the things that feel right and the things that a lot of these teachers know that is what kids are interested in or how they learn. Like, there's this big gap between what we know and what we have to do. And so I think that teachers try their best and they understand that the relationship is super important. And so they work on that. And I've seen how many kids love their teachers. And so that's a beautiful thing. However, I think that the incentives of the school system drive teachers to do the things that actually start to hinder learning. For example, this whole obsession around standardized tests and grades. I think that if teachers stop and think about it and ask the right questions and you get to the root of it, they realize that a lot of it is just nonsense and it's kind of like spiraled out of control and it's become kind of like the center of what education is. Like, they're not just assessments, they're basically everything that drives the boat of learning. And this causes a lot of things. Well, first, you don't focus on the things that are actually relevant for the real world, right? Because a lot of this assessments comes from curriculums that are very outdated or, again, that have nothing to do with what the kids are going to be doing in the real world. So when you focus so much on teaching to the test, which is what a lot of teachers typically do for many reasons. Their salaries are tied to this, their performance, they need to make sure that these kids do well on the test. And so they start to teach very scripted. They don't deviate from the curriculum. They pretty much do what's there. And they put a lot of emphasis on the grades and on these tests. And what ends up happening is that kids are not understanding, like, they're not learning for the sake of learning. They're learning so they pass these tests. They fear making mistakes and they become really risk averse because they know that if they make a mistake, which, by the way, it's part of the learning process, so it's like counterintuitive there, but they know that they're going to get that bad grade that goes in their report card and that, it kind of like haunts them for the rest of their lives, right? And so they are unconsciously driving kids away from things that they need practice in, such as making mistakes, trying to figure things out without instructions. Like, they become very scripted when in reality, the world is not as straightforward and the world doesn't come with all this guidance. We need to teach kids to figure things out for themselves, but that's not part of the curriculum. And so, I guess yeah, this whole notion around the tests and the grades is one of the biggest mistakes that I see teachers make. Then also, when you have 30 kids, you can only imagine walking in a classroom, 30 kids, it gets out of control sometimes, right? And a lot of teachers have this notion that you need to have all the kids like quiet, sitting down properly, because that's sort of like what we've lived for so many years. But in reality, kids are not meant to be sitting down quietly. They're meant to be moving around and asking questions and, like actually doing things, not just filling out worksheets. And so what happens is that teachers start to use incentives and punishments in order to control the circus, right? And what ends up happening is that a lot of these rewards that they use as incentives end up, not teaching kids the right thing. So kids start learning that they need a reward in order to learn, that they're doing things so that they get that gold sticker or that good grade or that extra recess time, or that they need to behave well so that they can have, that pizza party. And it's like, what are we teaching kids, right? To expect a reward in order to do something. That's the first thing. The second thing is like, what happens when you don't give them that reward or that punishment, right? They just don't want to do things because they're so used to that. So it's sort of like, it's the wrong mentality that they're, giving kids through this reward and punishment system. And so I actually tried something different because I saw a lot of this teachers struggle through this. And I was like, wait, this doesn't make sense. This is not what I want to teach my kids. I don't want to teach them to expect something in order to learn or in order to do the right thing. And so what I did was going back to this idea of giving them ownership over their work, giving them choices, giving them responsibilities, so that they knew that everyone expected them to do the right thing in order for a classroom to function properly and for everyone's voices to be heard and everyone's feelings to be validated. And so I explained everything, even the things that I, wasn't quite sure. I would try to find an explanation to it or ask them to help me find an explanation to it. But just providing the reason behind things is super important. And so I think that worked really well for me. I think that, there were no incentives in my classroom there were incentives, obviously, but not that were tied to rewards, if that makes sense. Like, yes, we had a chocolate bin, but I would give them just because it wasn't like tied to, oh, if you do this, I'll give you the chocolate. Yes, we had a bunch of parties and a bunch of things, but again, it was just to celebrate what we were doing, not as a gift, for what they were doing. And so I guess, yeah, those are some of the things that I noticed that work and that don't work so well for teachers in the classroom.
I know from doing research for this that your favorite age to teach was like 9 to 10, but I'm curious how teaching differs, if at all, in earlier ranges versus later ranges. How do you think about those differences?
Absolutely. So I taught first grade, third grade, and fourth grade. And so in first and second grade, what happens is you're teaching kids and again, this is in traditional schools, you're teaching kids sort of the basics, right? You're teaching them how to read. You're teaching them basic number skills and numeracy. And then what happens in third and fourth grade and older is like they need to have mastered, according to the system, how to read and the basics of numbers so that they can read to learn other things and so that they can use these numbers to make larger computations and learn about bigger things in math. So those are like two examples. And so I thought it was really interesting when I was working with the younger ones. They're very young. I mean, I'm talking about like 6 and 7 years. Like these are young. They're still learning like life skills and like, how to like stand in line to drink water and all these things that we teach them in school. And then there's a lot of pressure to get them to read at a very young age, which is very frustrating, both for the kids, for the parents, for the teachers, and this was one of my biggest frustrations teaching the younger kids. That I was like, some of them just don't feel ready, and that's okay. Like deep inside, I was like, I don't think this is necessarily a problem, but according to the schools, it was like, oh, if they're not reading by the end of the year, we need to put them in the reading remediation group, and I'm like, well, why? Like, this kid enjoys grabbing books and looking at the pictures and they're interested in the books. They're going to pick it up. Like, I'm not concerned that they're not going to pick it up. Also, the way that we were teaching how to read, it's very specific and some kids didn't learn how to read that way, but this is the process that we had to use for all of them. So what ended up happening, very frustrating, was that many kids would learn how to read, but then they associated it with school and with this like really daunting task, because it's hard to learn how to read. And they didn't want to read for pleasure anymore. And I was like, oh my gosh, red flag. Like, this is so concerning. Like, reading for pleasure is one of the most important things, right? That's how you keep learning. And so I was like, there's something wrong here. And then you had the other kids that just never learned how to read in first grade, and you had to put them in all this remediation groups. So they were like, okay, I'm the dumb one. I don't know how to read. There's clearly something wrong with me, all these labels. And so they started to believe this in their heads, that they were not capable, that there was something wrong with them. And so they didn't even want to try, because they were like, why should I even try? Like, I clearly can't do this. And it was very frustrating, because I knew the potential of these kids. And I was like, no, I just feel like the way that we're teaching them maybe doesn't match the way they learn, one. And two, maybe they're not ready just yet. Every kid matures at a different rate. Maybe they need a few more years. And so I started to do my research. And I know I'm deviating a little bit from your question, but I'll come back to it. And I started doing my research, like what happens with the kids that go to schools like Sudbury schools, which are like these democratic schools where kids have a lot of ownership over their learning. Actually, they decide pretty much everything. And they all start to read at different ages. And some start to read at, 12 or 13. And there's no pressure, right? They eventually all learn how to read at different ages. And once they learn how to read, they love reading. They love reading. They're reading all the time. And it's just like this habit that's just like for the rest of their lives. And so I was just very interested in that. And when I would talk about this with the other teachers and sometimes in the school, they were like, you're crazy. Like, if my kid is not reading by first grade, like there's a problem. And so I was like, this just doesn't match well with what I'm seeing. And so what happens in older, that I enjoyed more when kids are a little bit older is that, well, first of all, in third grade, they're still, they're a little bit older in that they know how to do their own things, but they're still not too cool for school. And so it's like that perfect age where they're still super interested in learning and they love their teacher and, they want to do things for the sake of doing things. Like, I feel like the system hasn't picked up yet, they haven't been in the system for long enough to kind of like suck out that love for learning and the creativity and all this. And so I still caught them there and I was able to cultivate that. And that to me was super exciting. Like seeing their eyes like, oh my God, we're gonna learn about this today. And they were like, oh my God, like that to me was just very rewarding. And then seeing them writing and reading and like doing all these things, but with joy was just really rewarding. But then what ended up happening was that they would graduate and move on to older, other teachers, other classrooms, and some teachers were really great. And they would start to lose this spark and this desire to learn. And some of them loved writing and they no longer want to write. And I was like, what's going on? And they're like, well, like they would talk to me because they would often come back to my classroom like after school or during recess just to catch up. And they'd be like, well, I'm like, what happened? You love to write. Like, well, they're making me write about things that I don't care about. They're giving me all this like parameters that I need to focus on. It's not about the ideas. It's about, the structure, the punctuation and this and that. And I lose points for this and topics that I'm like, and then my writing is going nowhere. And so I started to realize, wow, like we are grabbing learning and we're just kind of like taking it out of context and enforcing so many things. And the kids realize that. And so they start to lose this interest for learning, which is one of the most important things that I think you should cultivate in a kid. And so long-ended answer to kind of your question.
I appreciate that so much, that breakdown. And in particular, I'm curious what you spend time, you said from 6 years old to 12, 13 in terms of your teaching.
Oh, how many years I was teaching?
The place, the age ranges that you've taught.
Yeah, from 6 through 11. Well, some of them were 12. Yeah, from 6 to 12. Yeah.
Okay, so from 6 to 12, I'm curious what you then take with your newborn son and you teach him going from 0 to 5. Because a lot of people who might be listening to this might have newborn children or expecting someday in the future. So what should parents teach children before they even enter the system, quote unquote?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. So actually, and if you look at what some countries are doing, like Finland, kids don't start school until they're 7. And so when people hear this, they're like, well, what do they do? Like, what, aren't they super behind by the time they enter school if you compare them to? The answer is no. Because what happens is kids get to be kids until they're 7. So they get to play around, they get to explore. And remember that children are born with this natural desire to learn. If I look at my 9-month-old baby, he is just, oh my God, over the moon excited to learn about everything. Like he just wants to know everything. And that's normal for kids, right? And the moment they enter the school system, you start to see that decline, that curiosity, that creativity, that desire to know everything, that, the ability to question everything, like all that starts to decline. And it's because we start to penalize them for asking questions. We start to make everything super structured. There's no room for creativity and for problem solving and to question things. And so what happens is that we are robbing kids from the most important years in their lives, right? By putting them into these institutions where everything is standardized and there's so much structure and all the things that are quote unquote important for kids to thrive in the future, we're kind of like deviating from those to teach from this one size fits all curriculum. So from the moment kids are born till 7 or till the moment you decide to put them in school, kids should just be out venturing, doing what they do best, right? Like learning through play, learning through, socializing with other kids, learning by asking questions, and you just let them be them. And you don't have to worry, you expose them obviously to tons of books without forcing them to learn how to read. But if you see them interested in putting the vowels together and the sounds together, then you can start to make the sounds. Whenever you see that they have a productive interest in something, then you use that. I have friends that started to read when they were like 4 years old. Why? Because, right before they enter school, because they were super interested and their parents were like, oh, it seems like you're interested in it, let's go. So it's just a matter of finding what they're already interested in and then doubling down on that. Take them to a bunch of museums and to like different places and travel and do the things, whatever's under your control, but to have them learning naturally in the world, right? And so eventually they're going to end up, well, not my kids, but like a lot of kids are going to end up going to traditional school, and you already know that a lot of that is going to decline. And so the more that you can do before they enter, the better. And again, I don't have a straight up answer because a lot of it is unstructured. And so it's tapping on what they're already curious about and just, making sure that you don't let that desire to learn fade out.
What are you doing with your children?
Well, exactly that. I only have one and he's 9 months old. And so I have I have a lot of unstructured play for him. I let him explore around the house now that he started crawling. Like he's everywhere. And I actually don't like childproof everything in my house because I think that it's interesting to teach them about, boundaries and like how to coexist in an environment where you don't have to be like removing everything all the time. Of course I have things in the plugs, but like besides that, like I kind of let him like discover things and I don't intervene when he's like doing quote unquote dangerous things carefully, right? Because I want him to learn. And sometimes he'll fall and he'll bump his head and this and that, but he's learning by doing that, right? And so I do a lot of that. I take him outside a lot, even though now it's really hot in Miami, so that's a little bit hard, but I try to have him outside, have him play with other kids in the neighborhood. I take him to like little music classes and just the typical things that a lot of moms do. But the difference that I've noticed when I speak to my friends is that they're all talking about, oh my God, we need to enroll our kids into preschool ASAP. The slots, we need to be on the wait list. Like, Anna, what are you doing? Like, and there's so much stress around putting their 9-month-old babies into school already because of the applications and all this. And I'm not worried at all. Like not an ounce in my body's worried about it. And they're like, why? I'm like, well, first, because I've been in the system and I know what happens. And I know that they're learning more when they're with me and not there, 1. And 2, things are actually changing pretty quickly. And I'm, in a positive way, like the alternative education space is growing significantly, especially since COVID. That a lot of parents realize that there are options outside the system. And so I'm very optimistic with all the different products and all the different, alternative learning experiences that I'm seeing. And I already have in mind what I would do when I want for it to be a little bit more structured when he's older. And so I'm very optimistic that my kid is going to, learn everything that he needs to learn. And most importantly, love learning and retain that desire to keep learning Like, I'm not worried about that. I'm really not. And so by the time he is 7 or 8, when I want to make it a bit more structured, I'm going to see what's available at the time, and then I'm going to decide from there. But I'm really not worried.
So around 7 or 8, like, what is your ideal scenario for your child at that time?
So I'm part of this startup, this educational startup called Synthesis. When I decided to leave the system, the school system, 2019, I started writing and sort of all these questions that didn't make sense in my head from what I was seeing and doing and from being a student myself in 10 different schools. And then I started to write about all these things that I was, discovering. And I started to talk to different people, and I came across these 2 guys that were starting Synthesis. And I loved the way they would think about education and the future of education. And we just had a really similar philosophy. And I must say, small parentheses, they were one of the first people that I encountered that did not align themselves with one particular thing. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, Montessori is the way to go, or, Reggio Emilia is the way to go, or Waldorf, or democratic schools. And I think that these all have amazing things. But I think that the moment that you say this is what works, that's when unfortunately you're making a mistake, right? Because every kid is different. What works for one family may not work for the other. Even for one of your kids may not work for the other. So it's about grabbing ideas from all these great philosophies and methodologies and everything, and then finding, what kids need right now for the complex, ever-changing future that they're going to face. And so they had that same mentality. They were like, we don't associate with one specific thing. We're just like trying different things out. And so I joined them, and Synthesis has 2 products right now. So one of them is Teams, which are the simulations that we originally came out with that teach kids the soft skills that they're going to need to thrive in the future, but that they're not learning in school. Things like how to problem solve, how to think critically, how to communicate, but like communicate like an adult, how to engage in conjecture and criticism, how to figure things out when you don't have instructions, how to fail productively and pick yourself up, and what do you do now? And so all these things are super critical for the future that our kids are going to be living in. And they're not being taught in school, at least not explicitly. And so I loved what we were doing. And I was like, this sounds like the kind of education I would love for my kids and that I would love for every kid to have access to. And so I joined them when we launched that product. And now we recently launched the Synthesis Tutor, which I think is going to revolutionize education, like for real. So the holy grail of education is finding a superhuman tutor, because we've known for years that the best way to learn the core subjects or the hardcore academics, math, reading, like all the writing, all these things, and the STEM subjects is through one-on-one tutoring. But of course, not everyone is Alexander the Great that can hire Aristotle to be his tutor, right? And so for years, people have been trying to figure out how to make a digital tutor that actually works. And so we've actually figured it out, and it's incredible. And so the Synthesis Tutor that we launched this year is, it's from groundbreaking research of the DARPA founded a long time ago. And so the DARPA, the agency that, like the R&D agency that's in charge of creating all new technologies for the military. So a few years ago, they created this tutor, and they grabbed students to learn IT through the tutor. And in 16 weeks, they were able to outperform Navy technicians that were 10 years experts in their field. And so it was like groundbreaking research. And I can share the documents later that talk about this, because it's kind of like mind-blowing and mind-boggling to wrap your hand around this. But what we've done is we paired up with these original researchers at DARPA, and we have been building upon this technology and adding AI tools to create a digital tutor that's going to be teaching all subjects. And we started this year with math. And so the way it works is we find the best teachers out there. For example, for math, we hired Dr. Tanton. Dr. Tanton is this PhD teacher from Stanford that has been, has won 10 awards of Teacher of the Year internationally. He has written 26 textbooks in math. He's part of the Association of Math. So he's like an incredibly prepared teacher, but also his passion and zest for teaching math is like, you talk to him and you're like, this is the guy that I want to teach math to my kids. And so now what we do is we record him for hours and hours and hours, and we catch the way that he explains things, but not just the content. And this is what differs us from other things that are out there, but his examples, his stories are huge for learning. That human component that we were talking about at the beginning, the relationship that's so important in the learning process, we've been able to capture that, and the way he gives feedback and the way, like, everything in this digital tutor, to the point where you go through it and you can try it online for free. If you go to synthesis.com/tutor, you really feel like you are learning from a human. And so it's just incredible. And the way that it teaches is so effective, because it doesn't use like other apps that you see, like we were talking about earlier, those like rewards, like points and colors and characters that make kids kind of want to learn for that. Like, we don't have anything of that. We just have, like, you're chatting with the tutor. You have like a workspace where you get to try things out, and they don't tell you, like, when you get things wrong, this tutor is infinitely patient, something that unfortunately teachers can't do at school, right? You have 30 kids, you can't stay with one kid forever until they finally learn the content, right? And as a result, a lot of kids fall through the cracks. Here, this tutor's with you however long you need it. If you get the content fast, it will move you. And so it's this whole idea of no speed limits, right? So we push kids as far and as fast as they're willing to go. And the results have been astonishing. Kids are learning real math, and they don't forget after they take the little quiz at the end, which that's what's really amazing, right? In school, they're just learning for the test, and after the test, they forget. They forget because they don't get to apply what they're learning to the real world. And research shows that knowledge decays really quickly, and if you don't use what you're learning in 14 days, you're going to forget. And when I say use, I mean like actually put it to practice. And so here, the kids are learning these things, and they're putting it to practice, and they're understanding math, and they are incentivized and motivated by the fact that they are understanding why they're going to use these things. And so it sounds too good to be true, I know, but you get to try it. And so we started with math, but we are planning to cover all of the subjects, right? So we're going to start, we started with math, we're adding complexity science, we're doing literacy, we're doing everything. We're starting with the STEM subjects first. And so from now until my kid is 7, this is going to be just another, ship, right? Rocket ship going to the moon. And so I'm really excited to get him to learn the hardcore academics with the digital tutor. And the amazing thing is that, kids can do it an hour a day, and they have the rest of the day to engage, to be kids and to do the things that, whether it is play sports or, play, independent, self-directed play, or play whatever it is that they want to do, they get to do it because they have now freed up all of their day. And so we are essentially restoring childhood, which is incredible because a lot of it has been lost by putting kids in these institutions for so many. Think about it. It's like 7 hours a day, 5 days a week for 12 plus years. Like, that's insane, right? And so I'm just very excited about that. And again, we are making lots of mistakes in the way, and we're course correcting, and it's not going to be easy, but I'm very optimistic. So something like this is what I plan to do in terms of the hardcore academics. Then obviously the teams, in order for them to learn how to problem solve and critical think and work in collaboration, which is like crucial in this world. Like, it's just one of the most important skills, to be able to work with people from diverse backgrounds, with, diverse thoughts, and be able to do it effectively, and be able to make any team that you are at better. That's sort of like a goal here. And so, so those are some of the things that I'm definitely super invested for my kids. And then I love the idea of micro schools and forest schools, where kids get to go a few times a week and be with other kids, because all of this synthesis things is online. It is with other kids, but it's online. And so they get the social component by engaging outdoors with nature and learning from things that they're encountering. And so a mix of that is something that I find ideal.
When I drive past a school, I just look and I'm like, that looks like a prison. And I don't know if that is because of my own experience with school or my own lack of excitement about the curriculum that I was given. But to me, it strikes as so clearly like constraining, and it's frustrating. And, a lot of the world is getting revamped because individuals are getting power in a way never seen before. So an individual will get power to create a podcast, or an individual get a power to create a media company. And why wouldn't the individual also get power to teach their children how to do life most effectively? And with the individual power comes a level of responsibility that we once outsourced to an institution. What problems are people going to start facing as they are living and being the school system, the institution that they might not think about or come up against?
Let me see if I understood. So you mean if they don't start sending their kids to school, to these institutions, and they start doing it themselves? Is that what you mean?
I mean, like, individuals are now getting the power to be the institution themselves in a way. But what does that mean? Like, what difficulties would I come up against if I'm going to teach my children in a new way and I've never been in the system other than when I was educated in school, which might have been 20 years ago?
Okay, so what are some of the challenges that people that are having the courage to, not delegate or outsource their kids' education to school, but actually like do it themselves? What challenges may they face? Oh yeah, that's a great question. Did I get it right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here's what's interesting. When I think about education, I think of it as a spectrum, right? So let's say that all the way to the left, you have traditional school. And then all the way to the right, you have homeschooling, which is sort of, or like unschooling or world schooling, like this, like, all these other things that are. So you don't necessarily have, it's a spectrum. Like there are lots of choices in the middle, right? You don't necessarily have to, if you don't want to have your kids in school, you don't have to go all the way to homeschooling. And the reality is that very few families are able to do that because they have to work, because they have to drop their kids, somewhere so that they can go ahead and do their stuff, or just because they don't have the desire to teach, like 24/7 their kids all the things that they need to do. It's a very demanding job, and that's perfectly fine. And that's why there's a lot of people building in the middle. And so what I would say is if you want to go ahead and venture and do the whole homeschooling, there's actually a big community, and there's a lot of resources that before podcasts and websites and like Instagram and all these things, like people were just kind of like reinventing the wheel every time they wanted to homeschool their kids. But now there's actually like a lot of communities that can guide you and orient you, etc., if that's the path you want to go. Again, that's like to the extreme. And of course there are going to be challenges, and of course, but there's a good community there to guide you. But for parents that don't want to take it to that extreme, there are things in the middle that they can do where they are not outsourcing their kids' education to the school system, but also, and they have skin in the game because they are maybe deciding to teach a few subjects to their kids, or they decide to enroll them in things like synthesis or micro schools or forest schools or this kind of thing, or project-based learning schools. And so for that, I think the biggest thing is we're never going to know, until you try, if it works or not. And there's a chance that it works, there's a chance that it doesn't. I am of the opinion that school, if it's not working for you, like, and for your kids, which happens to be for many, many kids, it's not working, then anything you try will be better than keeping them in school. So I'm a very big believer in that. So it's about trying, having the courage to try something, knowing that there's a possibility that it won't work, but not fixating. A lot of parents are like, well, if I do that, then I completely like ruined my kid's education. Like I should have just stuck to the system. Like, no, like you can pivot several times. You can try something. It's like, actually, this is still not it. Then try something else. This is still not it. And try something else until you find what works for your kids. And again, it may be different for one kid to the other, and what will tell you if it's working? Your kid's attitude. Like if you see your kid like excited to learn and curious, and if this spark has returned, you will know. And you don't need a rubric, and you don't need grades in order to know if they're learning. And so a lot of it, it's just changing that chip and that mentality that has been reinforced for so many years, that we need to go to a traditional school system in order to learn, and they have to be in a classroom with a teacher and and tests. Like, the faster you're able to unlearn that and realize that there are other ways to do it, and that there are many successful people that have taken alternative routes and they're successful. But it's funny because we don't really look at their path. We just see them as, oh, they've been super successful. But if you look, many of them are high school dropouts or college dropouts. And, their stories are so powerful because they highlight something that every student feels, which is like, what's the point of school, right? And so, I guess I don't have a concrete answer for this, but a lot of it is just being willing to try things that may or may not work and pivot and keep trying until you find what actually works. The other thing is you're going to be going against, a lot of people are going to be against what you're doing when you do things differently. And they're going to try to convince you that you're crazy. Like, why would you want to mess with this? It clearly worked. I mean, you were doing well. And it's like, yeah, but it's not good enough. And kids deserve better than just okay, right? And so being willing to stay put and not let all these thoughts kind of like get to you, I think it's super important. And it's one of the biggest challenges that people trying to do things differently will face.
What about your experiences or your personal schooling makes you so passionate about this topic in particular?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this, and I think it has to do, so growing up, I lived in 7 different countries, and I went to 10 different schools. Because of my dad's job, we moved around a lot. So I was always the new girl, and I had to sort of like catch up, because many times I would move and start school, in the middle of the school year, or I would have to repeat grades, or I would have to, or skip half a grade. And so it was a lot to take in as a kid. But yet I was able to figure it out. Like, I was able to adapt pretty quickly and pick up on what the good student would do in order not to get in trouble, in order to appear as if I was learning, and in order to pass, so that I could get the school out of the way and actually do the things that I wanted to do after school without getting in trouble. And so, again, of course, I didn't realize this when I was growing up, but this is something that I've reflected on. Like, it's not that I was a great student, is that I was really good at picking up on the game of school, which is something that I talk a lot about in my book. And I didn't realize until I became a teacher, and actually when I was student teaching as part of my undergraduate degree program in New York, that I was observing so many students for so many hours in classrooms and teachers and this and that I realized that most of the kids, not all, but most of them, were playing that same game. They had picked up the shortcuts. They knew what to do and what to say to appear as if they're learning and paying attention, and what to do not to get in trouble. But there was no learning going on, and they were bored to death. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it just really dawned on me. And it was like, I could really feel it, because I did it so many times. And so I was like, there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way to spend kids' time and better learning experiences that kids actually want to be part of. And I made it my life mission to sort of find that and course correct childhood education. If you think about it, children are the explorers and inventors of our future. And I talk about this in my book, if we don't course correct their learning, then who will, right? And so a lot of what I do, and I'm super passionate about, is not necessarily convince parents to take their kids out of school tomorrow, although they may, but rather help them realize that our current education system just no longer meets the needs of kids today. And it's super important that we correct this, right? It's the way that we're going to push civilization forward. It's the way that we're going to have, a generation of happy, thriving adults. And so I'm really passionate about this. I think that through writing, I've been able to help a lot of people realize that there's a better way, or at least that the way that we're currently using is not the only or the right way. And so that motivates me to keep going. And now with synthesis and everything we're doing on a lot of my ideas are being tested there. And I just think it's a great place to get started to, because I'm a big believer that after seeing so many things and being a teacher myself and all this, like the system's broken and we can't fix it. We can't reform it. We need to create our own. And I think that that's what we're doing at Synthesis, for example. And that's a lot of what I try to dismantle through my writing. And so I'm just really passionate about this.
What incentives are happening at the highest level to keep school the way it is? Have you dived into that? Like the extreme levels of like, why would we go to this place for 12 hours a day to accomplish this? And it's like, how does this translate to the world we're living in today? And why is this the way it is? Like, who's controlling this? Why is that?
So, well, two things here. One, I don't think schools are going to go anywhere, unfortunately, because I think we're going to keep building things in parallel and have more and more options, especially now with school choice and everything. Like I'm very optimistic about the alternatives, but the school system is not going to go anywhere because it essentially serves as a babysitting center, right? A lot of parents still have to drop their kids off somewhere. And even though this may resonate with them, all these ideas of doing things differently and alternative education, this and that, they're like, I need to drop my kids somewhere where they're adults. So I don't care if they're learning or not, like they're safe and, it's not the worst thing in the world. But so that's just one thing. And again, I don't have a clear answer to how we're going to fix that. There are some things that are happening, and I can talk about it in a bit. But basically, I went deep into where this system came from. Why are we doing things the way they do? Like, who came up with this idea of like the specialized buildings and all this? And it turns out that it dates to 200 years ago in a region of Germany called Prussia. So at the time, they had just been defeated like brutally by Napoleon's army. And so they were like, they had just suffered this loss and they're like, we need to figure out a way to educate a population or younger population so that they can be loyal soldiers and so that this doesn't happen ever again. And so it was the first time that they thought of, using education as sort of nation building. And so that's where the basis of our modern education system came from. They came up with this idea of specialized buildings, of mandated attendance, standardized curriculums, having a squadron, or in other words, a teacher in front of the class, like teaching specific things, everyone doing the same thing, long hours in a day. Like this whole notion came from this system that they developed to train, again, an army of literate soldiers. And the system worked. They were able to do that, and they built one of the strongest fighting forces in the world. And so their model spread across the world like wildfire, and people started to adopt this model. And so, again, the goal was to sort of use education as a form of to build this like armies. And so, but it wasn't until World War II came around that it highlighted the importance of a nation's manufacturing capacity. And so suddenly the shift went from, they needed not necessarily soldiers, but like to train managers to work at factories and run corporations. And of course, the United States would lead this next development in the history of education because their assembly lines could make more ships and stronger ships and guns and everything. And so they led the next development in history. And the theme was standardization and efficiency. And so they created this idea of having, you group kids by age, you put them all through the same curriculum. You ring bells to move them from subject to subject. You extend the school day as long as possible to maximize output. You eliminate talking and playing and socializing to, minimize waste. So, and anyone who doesn't fit the mold is labeled as defective. So you see, pretty much like you would run a factory. And so again, it was pretty efficient at the time. It worked for, the industrial age. But then fast forward all these years and then this whole madness around coming up with like standardized tests that they used at the time to sort of like measure as quality control, kind of like, somebody working with cars would use to make sure that the cars are working. That's what they would use assessments for, right? And to keep schools accountable and to reinforce to administrators that they were doing things right. And so everything would run like a factory. It was never intended to create a generation of kids that could think for themselves, that could think creatively, and that could just become builders, right? And so many things have changed since 200 years. But if you look at education, it has not changed. And it became sort of like a way to indoctrinate the population. And again, it sounds very Machiavellian and this and that, but the reality is that it was built for a very different time and purpose. And things have changed drastically in terms of the skills that kids would need to thrive in this world that is constantly changing, that is chaotic, that doesn't come with instructions, that doesn't require people to fit in. Like the system that we built, everyone's learning the same thing and everyone's the same. And it's like, no, the people that succeed now are the people who break from the pack, who do things differently. And so even though our needs have changed so much, the system remains intact. And there are a lot of people up there at Power, creating curriculums that if you look at their background, they're not even educators, right? And putting all these rules and parameters, and we're just blindly following this. And so when I realized and did all this research, I was like, oh my God. And that's when I became even more excited to talk about this and share this, because I'm hoping that when people hear this and they do their own research and validate the facts, they realize, why are we even doing this? Obviously, we need an alternative. We need to start to do things differently. But it takes a lot to move the needle within the system and to try to do things differently within the system, which is why I don't believe that it can be fixed or reformed. It just we need to build a new one for, just like we build things for every other, field, an area of our lives. Like, we need a new way to educate children, period.
Yeah. What about adults? From all you've learned educating children, a lot of people listening to this might be in their 20s and might not have children, but want to be better learners themselves. And I'm curious what lessons translate from the things you've learned to help people be a better learner themselves.
Even better, what are the lessons that we need to unlearn in order to make room to learn the things that will actually help us succeed and be happy adults? So a lot of the things that are what's that word in English? Impeding, is that a word in English? Yeah. Adults from finding what they're unique at and what they enjoy doing, and what is because they have all these misconceptions that they learned in school that is actually not true, and that you need to unlearn in order to be able to do this thing. So for example, we've talked a little bit about how in school they teach you to be scared of making mistakes, and they teach you to be scared to fail, and there's no opportunity for you to practice failing. And if you think about it, failure is going to be part of our lives forever. And so the time to practice failing is when the stakes are low. So when you're kids, right, that should be the time where you get to fail over and over and over again and not get in trouble, but rather, be coached so that you realize what your mistake was and how can you learn about it so you don't repeat the same mistakes. We don't get practice with this in school. We get penalized for this in school. And so as a result, a lot of people are risk averse and they fear making mistakes and they just don't want to do it. And by the time that they start practicing is when they're already adults and the stakes are high, and it can mean a failed marriage, a failed business, and that's like catastrophic failure, right? The way to avoid that is by engaging kids in experiences where they get to fail, often when the stakes are low. And so the first thing you need to unlearn is that, like, fear of making mistakes. Like, mistakes are part of the learning process. They teach you so much. And, it's course corrections what allow you to get to new discoveries. And so that's one of the first things. The second thing is this whole notion in school, everything's like spoon-fed and everything comes with instructions, and kids have to wait for an adult to tell them what to do and what they're worth and everything. And this is totally inverse to what happens in the real world. Like, in the real world, you need to figure things out because things don't come with instructions most of the time. You need to think for yourself, and you don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do. You go ahead and you figure it out. And so this whole notion of waiting for instructions and waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, you need to forget about that and start to get comfortable figuring things out, which, by the way, is just like failing. It's a skill that you need to practice. And so one of the main things that we do at Synthesis is we give them plenty of exposure to all these challenges that we design, where they have to figure things out over and over again and engage in failure and pick themselves up and try again. They're practicing this every single day. Like, these kids are going to be so prepared when they're older because they already have this under their belt. So that's another thing. The other thing is, in school, we learn a lot of things on demand. Just in case. We should learn them on demand, which is sort of like something that I talk a lot about. In school, they're like, okay, we're going to give you all this curriculum and all this topic so that you learn them just in case you're going to use them in the real world. So a lot of people think that that's how learning goes. It's like, oh, you need to learn all this book and do that. Not really. Like, we have different interests, and when a need shows up, we need to use what we know about how to learn to learn whatever skill we want to learn. And so this whole notion of not waiting until you need the information, but not like learning things just in case, but waiting until you need it and then figuring it out. then this whole notion of, which we've talked about as well, like in school, they teach you to fit in, right? Everyone does the same thing. Everyone raises their hand. We're all going to learn about this. And if anyone who kind of like, it's a little bit outside of the mold, it's like, you're a troublemaker, this is wrong, and they make you feel bad, when in reality, those are the people that end up, creating incredible things, right? Because they're breaking from the pack, because they're finding something unique to sort of focus on. And so that's also another lesson. And then this idea of not asking questions. And we talked a little bit about it at the beginning, that kids are born with this like natural desire to question everything. It's how they deconstruct things from first principles. It's how they figure out how the world works. And so they have this, but they unlearn that, because eventually the adults are like, stop asking questions. Parents that are like, oh, I'm overwhelmed. They're like, you are asking too many questions. Like, stop, don't question why. And then the kids go to school, and in school it's the same thing. It's like, you don't question authority. You don't, if your teacher says something and you question her or him, it's considered like you're being disrespectful. No, we need to unlearn that. We should be able to question absolutely everything. When we question things, we innovate. That's like part of of real life. And so I encourage people to definitely forget that. Like, of course you get to be a skeptic and question things in the appropriate way, and that's fine. And so those are a few things. But the other thing that I realize is that schools focus too much on remediating kids' weaknesses rather than doubling down or supporting their strengths and finding what they're really good at, and then making them amazing at that. And then because of that, kids spend a lot of their years in school trying to catch up, or, lingering in the thing that they're not good at, instead of getting really good at those things that they are already passionate about and that have a talent for. And so as a result, they graduate with like low self-esteem, with no idea what they want to do with their lives or what they're good at, and then they go to college, and they, how many people do you know that have gone into the wrong major just because they don't know what to do with their lives and this and that? Like, I feel like if we started this process earlier of, what are you really good at? And I talk about this in my book, of finding your specific knowledge, what feels like play to you but work to others. And this since you're very young. Like, you have this. It's just a matter of refining it until you can make a living out of it. We would have happier adults that know what they want to do with their lives. And by the way, if it doesn't work, they can pivot and try something else. That's a whole other idea of quitting, which is fine. But so it's like, I would encourage these people that feel that way, that feel like, to reflect on their experience growing up, because a lot is going to come out of there. They're going to realize that a lot of their ambition or the things that they're good at was probably tempered down by school. A lot of the things that they believe are actually not right. And it's just a fabricated myth that school made them believe. And that's the first step, unlearning. And then you can start, it's never too late. Like, I've seen, I went through this course, Rite of Passage, with David Perel, where there were all sorts of adults of different ages, older and way older than me, that were looking for, to change professions, and were trying to find what made them unique and what they could offer the world and what they want to spend the rest of their life doing, what are they passionate about. And it was incredible, because it's never too late to find that, but you have to do a lot of work in order to get there. So I would encourage them to find alternatives outside. Like, it doesn't have to be college, by the way, that teaches you this. It doesn't have to, no, it's about finding a community of people that are going through sort of the same thing, and that are going to push you to try to go through that self-discovery process and find what makes you unique, what you can contribute to the world, and what makes you excited to do every day.
Did you ever struggle with figuring that out for yourself?
So I think that my journey went through a lot of transformation. So I always knew that I wanted to work with kids, and that has not changed. I always knew that I'm very interested in learning myself, but also teaching. And I wanted to shape the generation of, the younger generations. Like, that's something that I've always known, but that's been changing. At first I thought, I'm going to do this by being a teacher. I then realized that it's very hard to do this within the system. So I was like, okay, now I'm going to find alternative learning experiences, and I want to be a teacher there. And then I realized, wait, actually by writing and doing research about these things that I'm curious about and that I'm wondering and sharing it with the world, I'm having a way bigger impact with the parents that are then going to impact their kids, and their kids are going to have a different experience thanks to that. And so I became really interested in writing about education and doing research on education and creating content around education. And then I started to do a lot of research around how can, that joy component in learning. And I was fascinated and started to reimagine education through the lens of games. And I started to sort of be very interested in video games and started to see, video games so often are seen as the enemy, but then really they're like the ultimate learning machines. If you think about it, there's so many things that kids are learning by playing video games. And we can get to that later if you want. But anyway, you can kind of see how it's the same theme, but it went sort of like progressing. And then I bumped into synthesis when it was like just starting, and I joined them. And here I was able to really get into this idea of teaching kids the things that they need to learn in the real world to thrive in the real world through game simulations that are fun, that are engaging, that are super challenging. Because everything that I do and that we do at Synthesis comes from this counterintuitive insight that kids want to learn, unlike what you hear in school or what you see in school, and kids want to be challenged. And so these two things kind of like have pushed all the things that I've been doing and that we've been doing at Synthesis. And I think it's going to keep evolving. Like when people ask me, what do you do? It's really hard to explain because it's like, there's not, I guess it doesn't fall into one of those boxes because, and I think that's good. At the beginning, I would feel like a little bit uncomfortable, but now I'm like, I kind of like the fact that you can't explain very simply what it is that I'm doing. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. It sounds like a process of you saw something, you saw like something that was innate to you, and then you uncovered it by going deeper and deeper on that thing, which led to new paths and new discoveries. And I think that speaks to what we often have inside of us, which is like we know in some sense where we should put our time and attention, and then doing that will lead to something else that's kind of similar to it and kind of deeper and more you. And that seems to be the process of life, is just figuring out who we are by doing some things and then iterating on those. And, you mentioned video games before. I've personally never been interested in video games, but I'm curious what your research shows on why video games and children get along and what should parents do about video games?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to try to touch upon some of the main things. But one of the most interesting things that I found is, how we've been talking about the importance of teaching kids how to fail and how to figure things out and how these are skills that you need to practice, just like you practice playing the piano and playing any instrument. Kids don't really have a place to practice, failing and figuring things out. But in video games, it's so vastly different from when you see a kid fail in school. It's like, oh my God, they failed. They get really frustrated. They don't want to try again. It's like, I'm done. I got that bad grade. That's it. When you see kids failing in video games, they're like, oh, whatever, let me try again. And they try 1,000 times until they finally figure it out and they finally master that level and move on to the next level. Like I've never seen that level of commitment and perseverance like I see when kids play video games. So that's what initially hooked me. I was like, what is it about video games that make kids want to keep playing even though they keep failing? And so unconsciously, they are getting used to this, feeling of it's not the end of the world when you fail. Actually, by failing this level, oh, I already know what I need to do. And then the next level, they win. Why? Because they're learning. And so that's one thing. The other thing is it gives them this sense of, they're learning skills that are transferable to the real world. And I specifically talk about the research and how in my book, but basically the most important thing is that they learn how to teach themselves anything. And 2/3 of the kids going through school right now will end up doing jobs that haven't been invented yet. So what we teach them is not nearly as important, because that's going to be changing, than how they learn to teach themselves. And when kids are playing video games, regardless of what video game they're playing, if they're invested in it and they're spending time playing, they are learning how to teach themselves different skills. Now, the job of parents is to help them transfer these skills that they're learning in video games to the real world. Because oftentimes it doesn't happen automatically. It requires reflection, and kids are not naturally, going to sit down and reflect about, oh, what did I learn and how? They need guidance from an adult to reflect on what it is that they learned and how can this, translate to the real world. And so a lot of people ask me like, okay, but like, are all games good in this? Like, no, of course there are games that are better than others. And for example, at Synthesis, what I love about Synthesis is that we design, like we have one of the most incredible game studios in the world, where we design purposely these experiences for kids to experience all these things. And then we help them reflect how these skills transfer to the real world. So it's educational, but it's fun. We've kind of like figured out how to mesh these two things together. A lot of the things that happen with video games, that some are just purely educational and kids are usually not interested in those. And then you have the ones that are just entertaining and parents or kids have a hard time finding the value. There's always something that they learn, but extrapolating that and bringing it to the real world. So that's one thing that I find fascinating. The other thing is, when I was doing my research, the biggest thing that parents are super concerned with video games and they're like, my kids are addicted to it. And so I started to go down that route. Like, are kids addicted to video games? It turns out that no. Of course, there are rare exceptions, but the reality is that, and I talk about this in my book, that the humans need 3 core things in order to thrive and be happy, successful adults: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so if they're not experiencing these 3 things in the real world, they're going to try to find it somewhere else. Otherwise, they're going to get depressed and they're going to get sick. And that's just how humans work. And so if you look at each of these, autonomy in the real world, we've talked about this already. Kids have very little autonomy in school. They don't have choices over the things that they learn, how they learn them. Like, we've already talked about this. And so, but they need autonomy. Remember that in order to be healthy, happy adults, they need autonomy. So they're going to seek it somewhere else. When they're playing video games, they have tons of autonomy. They get to choose the games, who they play with, the characters, the levels, whatever. So they have a lot of choices and a lot of ownership over what they're doing. So naturally, they're going to be inclined to that because they're not getting it in the real world and they need it. Then competence. With all this like one-size-fits-all curriculums that we've put in place, like we said, kids are not, like, everyone matures at different levels. Everyone learns in different ways. And so if we only have one way, obviously there's going to be a ton of kids that don't fit that mold. And those kids never get to experience, or rarely get to experience, feeling competent. And so it's what we talked about earlier. They feel like they're not smart, like they're not capable. And again, feeling competence is it's a basic human need. And so if they're not like getting that in school, again, they're going to find it somewhere else. Suddenly they're playing video games and they're like, I'm really good at this. I just passed to the next level. Look what I just learned. Oh my God, look what I did. And so they get this like positive feelings that they're smart, that they're able to do things, and they feel competent. Obviously, they're going to be inclined to play. And then third, the relatedness. In school, with all this structure and all the lectures and the periods and everything, it's really hard for kids to really engage in to socialize. And I don't mean like those like 3 minutes between classes or those like 10 minutes of recess or in the bus. Like, no, I mean like actually have time to connect with other people, to work on things that you both find relevant or solve real problems, not those like wishy-washy teamwork worksheets in school that nobody understands why they're doing that. No. And so again, they're not feeling this need. They're not really feeling that relatedness component. And so in video games, a lot of the video games, they get to play with kids from all over the world, and they get to actually connect with people with similar interests. And a lot of these games are online. And so they get to find their people. Again, basic human need. And so when it comes down to it, it's not that kids are addicted to video games, is that they are not getting these crucial things in the outside world. And so they're finding it online, and they are getting them online. And so what I often tell parents is what you can do if you're concerned with the amount of time that they're spending playing video games, is you try to find why they're playing, what it is that they're missing in the real world, and you talk to them about it and you have them vocalize it so that they realize as well. And then you try to find that activity in the real world that will bring out that competence, that relatedness, and that autonomy so that they get this basic need. And so this actually solves a lot of this addiction problem that, that's not really addiction, but it's, what we just talked about. And so that's also really interesting. And there's just a lot to unpack here, but hopefully those are a few things. And I have a whole section about this in my book. So if you're interested, I really talk about all that for whoever's listening in the book.
What about screen time? I can imagine that a lot of parents are asking about screen time and what am I supposed to do about this? Like, I'm sure you've tackled it in the book. What is your research suggest on screen time?
Yeah. So one of the things that I often share is that screens are meant, like they're built in a way that they feel like they're never enough. And so when we're scrolling through Instagram, it can be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. It's never going to feel enough. When you're watching episodes on Netflix, you watch half an episode, 2 episodes, 10 episodes. You never want to turn off you're like, oh, it never feels enough. And that's because that's how screens are made. That's just like a general thing that we need to accept, we need to understand, and we need to try to help our kids understand as well. And so what I tell parents is, it's your job to keep your kids safe and to put limits. And it's their job to have feelings about it. And you need to be able to validate those feelings. So you're the adult and you know how to handle frustration. You know how much is too much. But they're kids. They're learning. They need guidance with this. And if you let them, of course, they're going to play all day if they don't have anything else to do because they don't know how to self-regulate yet. That's what the adult's there for. And so you explain to them. And by the way, this is not just for screen time. This is for any kind of negotiation you want to have with your kids. You walk them through and you establish the roles. You say, I'm the parent. My role is to keep you safe. You are the child. Your role is to have feelings about whatever parameters I give you. And that's fine. And I'm here to validate those. So you can play. You can, use your screens. It's not going to feel enough. Okay. So you're going to play, you're going to watch 2 episodes, or you're going to play an hour of video games, or, whatever it is that you decide. But then after that, we're going to stop and then you're going to come back to it tomorrow. So you give them the limit. When the time comes, they may complain because, again, screens are meant to feel like it's never enough. So you're like, you validate their feelings. I know this is super annoying. I know how you feel. It's frustrating. It doesn't feel like enough, but we need to stop now because that's just how much we're going to be playing today. You get to come back to it tomorrow. So it's about, talking to them, explaining why. And then one of the big things is, and it sounds like simple, but it's so important. You need to model the right behavior. We're all addicted to our screens and to our phones. Like, sometimes I'm like, I need to put it in another room so that I'm not tempted to grab it when I'm with my child, even if it's to take pictures and videos so that I can send to my family. It's this tendency to grab your phone and have your phone all the time. No, if your kid sees you with your phone all the time then you cannot enforce something. They're not going to understand. And remember that the misbehaviors come when they don't understand things. And so if they see you using it, but then you prohibit them from using it, it's like, this doesn't make any sense. So you need to model the behavior. And so in the book, I talk about examples like, saying something like, I've noticed that I've been spending so much time on Instagram in the morning when I wake up, and that time is essentially lost. Like, instead, I'm going to grab a book, or instead, I'm going to get in a quick workout, or instead, I'm going to come out and play, like whatever it is. But like walking them through how you also struggle with this, and then what you're going to do about it encourages them to do the same. And then modeling the right kind of behavior. Then also having a conversation. And again, this is something I did in my classroom too, not with screens, but just with other things. Making them part of the decision-making process and of the rules that you guys come up with. It's like, okay, what would make sense, like an appropriate use of our time, like during dinner? Does it make sense? Would you want for mom to be using her phone while we're having a conversation? No. So does it make sense for you to be using your iPad? Probably not. This is the time to bond. And so you come together to a rule or an agreement, and then they feel like they were part of it. So when the moment comes, it's like, oh, wait, I agreed on this. Like, it made sense to me at the time. So that just makes things a lot easier when you involve them when making sort of like the rules. And sometimes you can get them pick a rule and then you pick a rule. And so, and then it's like you're compromising, right? It's like the child feels heard and then also you. So screens are here to stay, and they're going to become just a bigger part of our lives. And it is our job to help them navigate this. And I'm just kind of like going on the surface level here. I cover it a bit more in detail in my book, but there's a lot of that you can do. And one of the main things I say to parents is don't make screens the enemy, because the moment they start associating that, like, oh, my parents hate it when I'm on my computer, my screen, they're going to start to avoid showing you or talking to you about this. And again, they need the guidance. Remember, they need the guidance because they don't know how to self-regulate. And if they start to see it like as a negative thing associated to you, then who's going to guide them? They're not going to come to you for help. And so make sure that you show some interest in their video game play or whatever it is that they're watching or doing. Show that you're interested, ask them questions and be a little bit part of it so that they open up to you, and then you can actually start guiding them through this process.
It's beautiful advice. From talking to you, it makes it like I usually ask the question, what is the modern day version of the cigarette? The thing that we accept as normal, that the world is maybe even putting on a pedestal. And I've never really thought about this before, but the answer in this moment that's hitting me is like the schooling system. Does a different answer come to mind for you?
No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry. I interrupted
No.
you. That's the same thing that jumped to mind for me. Like the school system, right? It's just something that it's so interesting, because the reason why the people that read my writing and look at and follow the stuff that I do come from a wide range of things is because education is something that matters to all of us and that we can all relate one way or another. We were all students once, whether it was homeschool or we went through the system but we were all young ones. So we were there. A lot of us have kids and we're starting to worry about, their education, what are their options, etc. Or just because we as adults want to recover and recover this love for learning or become better learners or get something more out of life. And a lot of it has to do with your experience going through the system, if that was your experience going through school. And so I think that a lot of people just go with it and just, continue following the patterns just because that's how we've always done it, until somebody makes them stop and be like, let me think about this for a second. Why do we do things this way? Where did this come from? Is there a better way? Oh my gosh, I remember how I felt here. How many of the things that I learned in school am I actually using now? What should I have learned in school that would have been way more practical and useful right now? How many hours did I spend in this classroom that were just wasted? What would I have done instead? And when all these questions start to pop up, that's when, that cigarette becomes apparent that it's an evil thing. It's like, oh my God, what am I doing, right? But it's crazy because it's not until you stop and reflect that you realize this.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to end these podcasts with a challenge, or ask the guest for a challenge, to point the audience or someone listening to do something in their day-to-day life this week, this month, this year. Does a challenge come to mind from everything we've spoke about, or something we haven't covered yet?
Yeah, I would actually end with something that I think I started the podcast with, which is stop and think back to when you were a kid, and really picture a picture of you when you were little, and you going through whatever schooling you went through. What were you excited about? What were you excited about? What were the things that really got you, I love this? What were the things that were not exciting for you, that you wish they were different, that were frustrating, that you did not understand why they were that way? And then just by going through that exercise, if you have kids, then you try to think about those things that got you excited and try to think, is my kid getting this right now in their current school setting and their current education? And if not, what can I do about it? And if you don't have kids, then just merely the act of reflecting of this, can help you be like, am I the best learner version of myself right now? Or are there things I need to unlearn in order to make room to keep learning? And so just a thought exercise that hopefully will get you thinking in a different way.
And to go along with it, The Learning Game by Lorena Fabrega, available wherever you get books, Amazon. Also check out Anna's Twitter, Anna Fabrega 11. Anywhere else we should send people to connect with you further?
So I'm recently starting again my Instagram, MissFab_Learning Lab, where I share a bit more visual of all these things that we're talking about. And my YouTube channel, you can find me under Ana Lorena Fabrega Miss Fab.
Well, those are all linked below. Thank you so much for your time, for explaining so much of the world that I haven't thought about for quite some time. And I'm grateful to get back in my life, because it is a massive problem that once you're done with it, you just put away. And hopefully my children won't have to go through the same troubles that I did, and you'll be part of a reason for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Danny, and for such insightful questions. I really loved this conversation.